I call myself an artist, an altarista, which is an altar maker and an educator. I have been teaching more than half of my life, but today I teach about this practice that I've been doing for over 40 years and how it has altered my life in many ways. I think that I've always been a spiritual woman. I always wanted to be an artist and a teacher. I knew I was an artist since I was a child, and I aspired to be a teacher when I was very young. I am both, but I'm also now, I'm not sure what to call myself, a spiritual person. And the people I work with, well, I work in the prisons with my daughter, Rosana, who's so wiser than I will ever be. And she has really taken on the lead as far as the work that I'm doing. I'm 92 years old, and my children are carrying on with this tradition of altar making. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a bit. But the people that we work with, inmates, women and men at their designated prisons, they say, is this a religion? And it says, well, maybe you could call it, it's a religion about you, your spiritual life, and how you can navigate your life, your journey from here on, tools that you will need to support you. And all of us have all we need to bolster ourselves, to empower ourselves. But we have to discover it, we have to look for it and nurture it. And no matter what your situation is, of course, the people we work with never ask why they're there, but we do say that you're bigger and better than why you're here. And so those are the things that we want to explore. And it all stemmed from just my practice of doing these ofrendas, altars. It is spiritual work. It's an art form, yes, but I learned about it spiritually before I called it an art form, because I had never done public altar making until 1979, when I joined a art center near my house. It's become it's international now. It's called Self-Help Graphics, and it was started by a Catholic nun, and I always say a nun like none other. She was she was from the Franciscan order, an artist, and her community were studied under Corita Kent, who was an artist herself. But the influence of her teaching is humanitarian. It's about world peace. It's the things that I have have adhered to and have admired in other people who work that way. And so Sister, I still called her sister. My upbringing, I could never call her just Karen, but the younger artists always did. And she was tough, a chain smoker, coffee always in her hand. She loved our community. She lived in my community during the Chicano movement, political turmoil period. And she was very keen on empowering our community. And since she was an artist, she and two other artists established this garage studio where she invited local artists to come in and do art. But she was basically a printmaker. And they set up a printmaking space in the garage. And then she decided that she wanted to do a community event that would bring the community together, and just to have a positive place in our community during this, this political, during the Vietnam War. It was the basis of it at first. And so she had seen a film by the artist Charles and Ray Eames, and they did lots of filmmaking in Mexico about the craftsmanship of folk artists. And she saw a film on Day of the Dead, filmed in Oaxaca, Mexico. I think it was 1950. So she showed that film to the community Sister Karen established workshops on Saturdays to celebrate Day of the Dead, based on that film that she had seen and was showing us. And so she had invited artists to come and make artifacts and items, and she created a procession from the studio near my house, and then to a local cemetery that you could walk to, walking distance. And so the workshops, and when I came on, she said, I would like for you to help with this other artist, Michael Amezcua, who was making these huge headdresses made out of cardboard, painted, and they were to be, he made some, and then the workshops we helped people who came to make these. And she says, but I want museum quality items because UCLA is interested in acquiring some of these artifacts. So my first project there was to make these headdresses out of cardboard, painted, and they were beautiful. I wore one of them the first time I was there, but other people did. And so we wore those on a procession to the cemetery, where they had ceremony, Native American dancers. Well, it's a Native American tradition, the way Dia de los Muertos is celebrated in Mexico. And that is a melding of the Catholic tradition with indigenous traditions and rituals. The church never had all these outdoor manifestations of having food and ceremony around an ofrenda, an altar. But today it's everywhere, even in Mexico. I think for a period of time in the early 70s and 80s, I think Los Angeles was doing more of this kind of celebration than in the big cities in Mexico. The indigenous population, the small towns where very indigenous traditions are still very strong. They have always done this kind of celebration. Well, I learned about those ancient traditions, but what I learned was from my mother, from her village, and we never had skeletons or skulls, which is a very an icon that goes back several thousand years. And so, but she always had a little ofrenda or altar in her home that she dressed up for special occasions. And she had like 4 different occasions during the year, based on the religious calendar, the Catholic calendar, because the place where she was born was a small village, ancient village, where many indigenous traditions were practiced, but they're very much part of the Catholic Church. It's an interesting story that how the indigenous people created, they embraced the Catholic religion, but I think at the beginning was to save them from the genocide and the bloodletting that occurred when the Europeans came to Mexico. Anyway, so that's kind of the background, a very, very brief, sketchy background. And so my mother was very happy that that we were doing these altars, and they were public. I had never done public ones. I had watched my mother, and she never had a big celebration, but we always had observed it, especially for my great, I think three grandmother who raised my mother. My mother was raised by this elder great grandmother in this small village. So my mother learned all these traditions, not only the celebration, but the paper making decorations and the cooking. And so I didn't learn the cooking, unfortunately, like her, but I learned to make all these paper decorations, mostly flowers. And so my mother was known for her artistry that the neighbors would sometimes buy from her, sometimes my mother, for weddings and baptisms and all kinds of parties, and floral mortuary florals that my mother used from her garden. And that's how my mother was very resourceful. And I mentioned it earlier. I never lacked anything. I never knew we were poor. We always had plenty. I enjoyed my childhood. My mother was so resourceful, and I learned to make so many things, except the cooking. My husband would say, "You mean you didn't learn to cook like your mother?" No, I was
cooking.
Sorry. But you have my daughters always have to check on me because I could go on. Well, part of it, I think, is just my interest, my mother's cultural traditions. She was very strong on just keeping up these traditions she grew up with, and a lot of it was art. My mother never called herself an artist, but she could make many things that were decorative. When I was a child, our house was very sparsely furnished. We lived in this adobe house, but the decorations and the time to make things from her garden, the plants, she would make wreaths and bouquets, and the paper. I have to say the story about my being an artist. I was just drawn to patterns, nature's patterns. I would rake the yard. It was all, dirt. With a rake, I would make these patterns. And the umbrella tree that was in our yard used to drop these long stems, and I would pick them up. They reminded me at that time, there was a game called Pickup Sticks. So I would use them as to play with, but I would also make designs with them. I was just very interested and observant of nature's patterns, the sand designs when it rained and all these things. So my first my first memory of drawing something, we lived in this old adobe house, and I discovered that it was soft. With my fingernail, I could, make a design. So then I got a nail, and I drew a house with a tree right in the wall, and the wall was about 24 inches thick into the next room. My mother said, "Oh no, you can't do that." And so it's what my mother started doing when the meat market packages, the butcher paper, she would flatten it out and iron it and cut it into big spaces. So I had plenty of paper to draw on, and it was just pencil. And that's what I did when I was a child, drawing just what I saw. But as an artist, I didn't study. I didn't have a fine arts degree, but I learned art just by myself. And then I had mentors later on. And so that kind of activity, this is, I guess all artists, it becomes part of it's ingrained into your life and your lifestyle. But in addition to that, the cultural elements that I grew up with were very important. So altar making was something that fell into my life, first by my mother in a very humble and private way, but then at Self-Help Graphics in a public way. So that's where I had like free reign to just explore what I already knew. But it was influenced by my mother because she liked to have lots of things, because her biggest, her heart was with a nativity scene. She was known for the decoration, and it was a huge installation, half the living room or small living room. And then she became known for that. So neighbors would come. She would have their ceremony and ritual related to the nativity scene, Christmas time.
Epiphany.
Yeah. And so she always hosted that every year. The neighbors would come. But her nacimientos were always multi-level and had lots of things in it. She would visit her village in Mexico almost annually since I was a child. I never went. It was always during school. I never missed school. And so she had many levels and lots of vignettes, but it was never Bethlehem. It was Guanajuato, Guanajuato, her village. And then she would make paper things to decorate it. And then by the time my siblings and I got married and had children, the kids would come in and enjoy it. They would look. Sometimes they would put a toy in there, and she would keep them. I always laughed at there was a crocodile that was part of her ceramic piece that she had, but it had a jaw that opened, and one of my kids put a a soldier in its mouth, and she left it there. So that was part of the nacimiento.
The beginning of.
But it was multi-level, and the altar that my daughter and I did at the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles is a permanent altar, and it's encased in this glass case, and it reminded me of that because the space is small, but it has 4 levels, and it's from bottom to the top almost, and it has over 400 pieces, but there's vignettes that represent each community of Los Angeles. It's dedicated to the cultural diversity of Los Angeles. So it has many, and that's the way the nacimiento. So I used to love to see it. And when I started helping her, I would add my own piece to it. But it was always my mother's nacimiento. She would always say, I want this here and I want that there. If I wanted to change, she says, well, when I die, you could do your own way. This is the way. So that was a great influence. And I'd like to have many things. They tell stories. And if the people were honored, especially if it's my own family, the stories about them are reflected in the way that the items that are there. Maybe they're grouped separately, but it's a cohesive piece. So it has elements of art that I learned. I have a certain aesthetic, and that's what I aim for. And yes.
Visually.
I think when Sister Karen died in 1997, I was, of course, I did the memorial altar for her. She was still a Catholic now, and they held the memorial celebration at the studio. It's an old building in East LA. The second story was the salon, and that was a monumental piece because so many ofrendas or offerings came from artists and from community. I mean, she was such a big, important person in the art, especially in Chicano community. And well, Self-Graphics is credited with starting this public celebration of Day of the Dead in Los Angeles, or maybe in the U.S., always in Mexico, but we were far removed from Mexico. It's
land.
It's like a renaissance. And I say, well, we share it with the world now. But of course, people in the U.S. didn't know, even Mexican American people, even people today who are not artists, or it's still not, it's part of the Catholic tradition, the celebration, but the style of doing it is still not done by the whole country. Very commercialized, I have to say, in the big cities. But the small villages, you see the tradition continuing with the same rituals. It's beautiful. But they are storytelling installations. Well, one of the things I always say, the altars that we make, now my children are doing this too, is I celebrate the life of people, my loved ones, but also people who have made a mark on my life. And I want to celebrate their life, how they were loved, not how they died. And so I'd like to say that what a legacy we have to be loved and cherished even after death. But it calls for a way of living too, that we are remembered, cherished after death, whatever our circumstances are. And so I call it a bridge, that the ofrenda, or making the ofrenda, is a bridge between life and death, or the living and the dead, and of generations. And today, even countries, communities, well, I hope that continues, because it calls for the greater picture of what a foundation for being civil and being loved and being kind and being helpful and being, vital in your community. You're remembered with like that. But whether you are or not, your family, and I always talk about this. My mother said this to me, but my mother didn't invent it. She must have heard it from her Mama Pola, who raised her, this great-great-grandmother, who heard it from her mother, and said that I don't know where it came, but it says that we all suffer three deaths. And that the first death is the day that we give our last breath, the day that we die. And our second death is the day we're buried. And my mother would say, never to be seen on the face of the earth again, which sounds so final, but the most final, the most dreaded death of all is to be forgotten. And so you're not forgotten till when no one remembers you, then you are. Who were you? Where were you? So it's so important. And I always, well, even my children are saying this. We will never let our loved ones or people we cherish to suffer that third death. And so it entails so much more than just building an altar.
Yes, Allison, I just want to add to that the manifestation of the cosmos. So I know for certain that I will never be forgotten, because the tradition in our family is to visit the cemetery, and we hit all of the tombstones in our family. And I know when I am buried there that I will be by my, because they are bringing their own children, my mother's great grandchildren, their babies, and they go and they attend the Day of the Dead festivities.
And you know, the ancient people of Mexico, their religion or their belief was that there was no word for it. It wasn't death completely. It was another phase of life. And my mother would say, there's no life without death, and there's no death without life. They're connected. So that bridge, the altar creates that bridge that you can go back and forth. But the important thing, even more than just visiting the ofrenda, is to talk about, you know, have especially the children remember know who they are, the photographs or stories. You know, my husband died 33 years ago, and we never stopped talking about them. My mother is always I always mention her. I'm talking about her right now. Whatever it is, a plant or we're working on some craft or the cooking, it was part of my life. She was a great storyteller, so I got to know her. Mama Pola is who she called her, the woman who raised her. And I talk about her all the time. I felt like I knew her intimately, although I never met her, because my mother's stories never ceased. It was like she was talking to her. In fact, she would talk to her. But, you know, it's a sad time, but it's also a celebration of their life. So I call it a celebration of life. And it doesn't end on the 2 days of the year. It's all the time. You know, I did a paper when I was at the university on death. It was based on the high price of dying. It was focused on that in American studies. And I learned how, especially in American society, that people don't talk about death. Even some of my friends, they shield the child from death. It is a terrible, sad thing. But when I was a kid, we would go to all the relative wakes and funerals. We're part of the family. We're always there. And it was just part of the celebration that we were used to. And so you deal with death in a way that it's a natural thing. Of course, it's sad. And people say, but don't you mourn? Of course we do. It's sad, and we cry, and we miss. It's really a coming together of community, but even if it's just your family, but when you celebrate it, people join it. You know?
I'm going to stop recording now. So I'm just going to say thank you.